We're moving on now to nonverbals. In nonverbals, we're going to discuss paralanguage, and this includes vocal qualifiers, vocalizations such as non-word vocalizers, and tone of voice, as well as timbre. And so we're also going to look at facial expressions, eye contact, smiling, and we're going to look at gestures, timing. I mentioned this earlier: touch or haptics, space, appearance, attire, body beautification, which we touched on when we talked earlier about women and like the neck rings and things like that. So we'll move on to those aspects of physical environment and artifacts, and also close with color symbolism. And we did touch on all of those in our first week. But on to nonverbal language and intercultural communication. In other communication courses, you might have heard when verbal and nonverbal messages differ, we tend to believe the nonverbal over the verbal. And in face-to-face communication, up to 93% of the messages may be nonverbal. Like 93% of any communication may be nonverbal in nature. So nonverbal messages are important, and wise leaders know they need to be paid attention to. By nonverbal communication, we mean communication beyond the spoken or written word. So this would involve things we've already discussed, such as business logos, symbols, icons, tables, graphs, photos, drawings, diagrams, and much more. So nonverbal communication has to do with lots of different components. As I mentioned earlier, one of these components is paralanguage, which para means resembles. And obviously, so paralanguage would be sound made by voices, not by words. And the biggest problem with paralanguage is that it's not as precise as actual words. It would include things like a vocal qualifier, vocalizations, the tone of voice or the timbre, as I mentioned earlier. And we want to look at each of these individually so we understand them. Vocal qualifiers are things such as pitch, volume, and the melody of speech. Pitch is how high or low speech sounds, and high pitch can reflect anxiety or excitement. Pitch is important to tonal languages, in tonal languages where a word's meaning may depend on it. For example, in Mandarin Chinese, it has 5 tones. And depending on the pitch in each tone, the word ma has 5 different meanings. And it can be mother, linen, horse, to scold, or it can be used to signify a question. And pitch reflects certain differences in meaning between cultures. For example, American English has a lot higher pitch than French. To an American ear, French can sound sterner and unhappier than English. It can even reflect differences in meaning within one language and within the same culture. For example, in the Russian language, to convert to an affirmative statement, you don't need to change the word order at all. You just change the inflection. So if you're saying you went to the park versus asking you went to the park, you just change low to high in the same way we would here in America. Like you went to the park, you went to the park. So volume is going to be a big deal because have you ever thought about inappropriate volume used in a professional setting, especially if it's a cultural norm that you've violated? When we speak at our natural volume, we're often perceived as loud by non-Americans. And this can be something that a vocal qualifier such as melody, putting emphasis in the wrong place in a phrase can also miscommunicate something. When a pitch goes down at the end of a phrase, the cadence can suggest a speaker is finished. And this could communicate that you're done, and somebody could think that there's a verbal cue that somebody else can have a turn to speak. It can be a turn taking or a turn giving cue that's not meant to be there. Paralanguage also includes vocalizations. And these can be your fillers like hum, out. They can have a lot of meaning. They don't always just have to be filler words that are put into a presentation like or can be an agreement. So you can be saying as you're engaged with somebody, what somebody's saying, or you're agreeing. It can be that you're just letting them know that you're listening so they can keep conversations going. So vocalizations can be important in moderating conversation. Let's take a look at one more piece in paralanguage, and this is tone of voice. It's incredibly important because it conveys emotion and mood. A simple phrase like, "you can consider your work done," can have 6 or more meanings depending on the tone of your voice. Dismissal, affirmation, congratulation, warning, feedback, and even releasing someone from responsibility. I used to use the example of somebody, when you got home from work, a partner asking, "How was your day?" and somebody saying great, and how many different meanings that could have. If you say great and you're really smiling and you mean great, or if you toss your keys on the ground and really sarcastically say great, think of how many meanings you can convey depending on the tone of just one word, great. Facial expressions are also important and communicate a lot of feeling with the words. And some feelings aren't appropriate to show in some cultures, so you have to be really intentional about those facial expressions. You may be communicating anger, anxiety, disappointment, disapproval, and you may have heard that feet are dirty in some cultures, so you're never supposed to show the soles of your feet. And you are never supposed to sit, obviously, with your feet up on a desk, because or your soles of your feet may be showing anywhere. It's just not considered polite. And some students have traveled again over to China and said that they were given kind of dirty looks because they had their feet up with their soles pointed to statues that were considered reverent, and so that was considered disrespectful as well. Also, the way of, thinking about your head. Noreen Dresser, in her book Multicultural Manners, this came out in 2005, there's an example of people in Southeast Asia, the head is taboo. And because it's believed that somewhere here resides the soul of the person. And among the Hmong people originally from Laos, they have that belief. So there was a preschool here in the United States, and a new teacher had just come and been given a very brief orientation. And she was to teach the children colors and parts of the body. And these had outlines of the body, and she would say, color the hands orange, color the feet purple, color the clothes green, put brown eyes on the face, and the children wouldn't do it. Put a red mouth, the children wouldn't do it. Everything she asked you to do, every feature to put on the blank face, the children refused to do, and she just couldn't understand what was going on. And then after the class was over, another teacher said, "Oh, we forgot to tell you, the Hmong have a belief that the spirit resides in the head and it's sacred. You don't touch it." So a lot of Americans believe that eye contact is a sign of honesty, and that if you look someone in the eye, you mean what you say. And if somebody avoids eye contact, they may have something to hide. We may interpret that as negative. But in Japan, and many of you may know this, that direct eye contact is seen as aggressive, it's uncomfortable, and it's an intrusion into privacy. So many Asian and Latin American countries do avoid direct eye contact, and it's the privilege of only those with the higher authority. So any power gap, any high distance culture, a person of higher rank or authority can look at somebody with less authority directly in the eye, but the subordinate is expected to look down or away or avert their eyes. This is a sign of respect. Smiles are also a culturally sensitive thing. People smiling, it can communicate some different things depending on culture. Some American companies have tried, and somewhat unsuccessfully, wanting to teach their foreign customers and representatives to smile, because the management was driven by fear that they may be perceived in different ways depending on cultural norms. It's not always seen as a positive thing to smile. You're not always seen as customer oriented if you smile at others. So let's watch a short video from the Atlantic that provided some insights into the nature of smiles.
Travel advice to tourists visiting the U.S. points out one custom most Americans wouldn't think twice about: their smile. Guidebooks explain to tourists that Americans smile to strangers a lot. So why do Americans smile so much? And why is that so strange to everyone else? Americans seem to smile even when there's not a very good reason to. When you see an American smiling, they might be feeling happy, confident, or neutral. Sometimes it's just a polite way to make someone else feel comfortable. Think service with a smile.
Here's your receipt. Thank you very much.
In other countries, though, smiling for no reason can make you seem kind of dumb. One researcher found in countries like Japan, India, South Korea, and Russia, smiling faces were considered less intelligent than serious ones. His theory is that there's a connection between a country's level of instability and finding smiling stupid. After all, how can you be so confident and happy when the future's uncertain? That might help explain stereotypically frowny places like Russia, where smiling in photos isn't really a thing. There's also some interesting research that helps explain the other end of the spectrum: why Americans have stereotypically megawatt smiles. It turns out that countries with a long, robust history of immigration have historically relied more on nonverbal communication. Therefore, people there might smile more. In a recent study, researchers looked at the number of source countries that have fed into a country since Columbus arrived in the Americas. Places like Canada and the United States are very diverse, with more than 60 source countries. But places like China and Zimbabwe are more homogeneous, with just a few nationalities represented in their populations. The authors found that emotional expressiveness was correlated with diversity. In other words, when there are a lot of immigrants around, you might have to smile more to build trust and cooperation, since you don't all speak the same language. But in the countries that are less diverse, people were more likely to smile to show they were superior to one another. In these countries, smiling is a way to preserve the hierarchy. But Americans don't just smile more often, they also smile much more enthusiastically. For a study published last year, researchers compared the official photos of American and Chinese business and government leaders. After coding them according to their levels of facial muscle movement, they found that American leaders in all contexts were both more likely to smile and showed more excited smiles than the Chinese leaders did. Later, they found the more a country's college students valued happy, high-energy emotions, the more excited the government officials from those countries looked in their photos. Cultural differences in smiling don't just confuse foreign tourists visiting the United States. They also come as a surprise for American companies doing business abroad. When McDonald's went to Russia in the 90s, they had to coach their employees on how to smile. But when Walmart opened stores in Germany, it had to tell its sales clerks to stop smiling at customers because some people saw it as flirting. In other words, the American smile is a product of its culture, and like any other product, we try to export it around the world.
Let's talk about gestures. We have head movements, we have arm movements, we have hand movements, and obviously we have posture. If you do business internationally, gestures would probably be one of the most important to really be careful of. Gestures don't really translate well across cultures. The okay gesture is very offensive in Brazil, Germany, Russia, many other countries around the world. For example, Middle Eastern countries, it's meant to depict like a bodily orifice. And in Japan, it means money. And in France, it means zero. So if you're drinking wine at a business lunch with your French partners, and after tasting the wine, you show an okay sign, they might interpret it that you think the wine is bad. And gestures will be an important part of greeting. So an example from Dresser 2005 said he talked to a man who had gone to New Zealand, and he was so shocked because he saw a man waiting for a passenger to deplane. And when he came out, he was in a suit carrying a briefcase. And when they greeted, they pressed their heads together with their noses together and didn't know that that's a Maori form of greeting. They're actually inhaling their essence. A few words on timing in spoken exchanges. Something that chronemics studies as an important consideration in international meetings is how to take turns in turn taking. What's the role of interruption? In some cultures, interruption means a person's highly engaged in conversation, while other cultures, interruption is very rude. And so You also want to consider who initiates conversation, what are the patterns of frequency of exchange, how, if interruption is allowed, how do you do this appropriately, when to take a turn, how to end an exchange, how much speaking time is allowed, is it dependent on status or age or influence, who gets to dominate the conversation, all these rules and how they apply. With regard to touch, this would include things like handshakes, arm and shoulder contact, embraces, kisses. Some cultures kiss on the cheek, other ritualistic greeting behavior. But even a simple handshake can be hard to master depending on the culture. In the United States, it's considered polite to have a good, strong handshake that's confident but brief. But in Mexico, it's a lot longer. And in China, there are a few things that are unacceptable when shaking hands. In shaking hands absentmindedly, such as shaking hands with a left hand, shaking hands while wearing a hat, gloves, or sunglasses. Those are all things that are kind of absent-minded handshaking or meaningless handshaking. And to indicate a warm welcome, somebody may put it between two hands. And holding hands is also something that is a kind of a delicate rule. As I mentioned, kissing on the cheek as a greeting can be done in some cultures, and in some cultures, this may be done by acquaintances, friends, even coworkers, where a greeting of a kiss on the cheek or even on each cheek may be just a way to say hello. Proxemics or haptics and zones, how people use space to convey messages. And generally, there are 4 different distances depending on the closeness of a relationship between people. There would be intimate distance for confidential communication, more personal distance for family and close friends. Then business transactions usually happen at what's considered a social distance. And that last furthest level is considered a public distance for like public speaking and presentation. And as you can guess, how far we are from each other and how far we're standing at each of these levels differs across cultures. So in Latin American cultures and countries, social distance is shorter than it is typically in the United States. In Sweden, Swedes are famous for loving their personal space bubble. And this is so much so that memes have been made about it. And while waiting for the bus, you're supposed to stand at approximately an arm's length from the next person. So this picture is perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, but the idea is that you really want to keep your distance. And then as you look at the picture at the bottom, we see that almost nobody's sitting next to each other. And more than that, the people do not look at each other, stare at each other in some countries. And in public speaking in Russia and in India, staring is okay, but Swedes kind of look out the window and don't make eye contact. So a few words on appearance, business attire. Many American, Asian, and European businessmen wear dark suits, white shirts. Where Middle Eastern businessmen often wear the dishdasha, like the white outfit in the picture on the far right. Businesswomen wear conservative clothing appropriate to their cultures. A lot of Japanese companies require their female employees to wear high-heeled shoes. And within one gender, norms of what's appropriate in business vary widely across countries. So in many European and Asian countries, men wear a lot more tight-fitting attire than in the United States. And of course, there are different perceptions regarding body beautification. Some countries, beards and tattoos are not acceptable in business, and they are considered that they're not well groomed to the people in that culture. This may be changing more and more as we see, more and more acceptability for tattoos in the workplace, piercings in the workplace, things like that. A few words on physical environments and artifacts. Sophia Sa, who taught this course for many years, shares that a friend of hers who was an American who lived and worked in Europe put on Facebook that he put a quote on that said, "I'm getting a MERS. I don't care. It's not looked down on in Europe." And a merce is basically a man purse. And he remembered talking to a friend who studied gender perceptions in different cultures. So gender norms vary widely across cultures and can actually communicate gender identity based on different artifacts, different representations of gender identity based on what you choose to display, what you choose to wear, how you want to be represented in your appearance, colors, attire, artifacts, jewelry are just a way of expressing ourselves and our identity, our gender identity, our sexual identity. Next slide. Color can communicate messages, and that's called chromatic studies. Black is usually a color that can indicate mourning, except in India, where people wear white to funerals, and white wedding dresses can have traditionally been seen as a sign of purity. But in Hong Kong, Nepal, and India, red is traditionally worn to signify luck. So a bouquet of yellow roses sounds great, except in Chile, where it means I don't like you. To summarize, literally anything in our environment and in our behavior can convey a message or say something about who we are, our culture, our identity. So hopefully this week, this has given you some things to think about, what to watch for when you lead international teams or travel yourself for business or for pleasure to other countries. Take care.